Hi, and welcome back to the series on using manual mode here at photographycourse.net. In this video, I'll teach you about the controls you need to learn to be able to use manual mode well. Since the earliest cameras, they've not really changed so much. This old beauty is now 54 years old, and it is really basically the same as the more modern digital cameras that we use. Has a lens, and inside the lens there is a diaphragm called an aperture. It works pretty much the same way the iris in our eye works. So it has an opening that contracts to let less light in or opens up to let more light in. Then the next tool for controlling exposure is the shutter, and this is a blind inside the camera that opens and closes when you push the shutter release button. This controls the amount of time that the film or the sensor in your digital cameras is exposed to light. So the aperture and the shutter can be used together to control how much light affects the sensor. Then with the sensor in a digital camera, you've also got the option to control how responsive it is to light, and this is what the ISO setting does. Using manual mode, it's important to learn how these three things work together to control the exposure. If you are set to manual mode on your camera and you don't get your exposure settings correct, you're going to have either an underexposed photo, that's one that's too dark, or an overexposed photo, which is too bright. So by controlling the aperture setting, the shutter speed setting, and the ISO, you can control the amount of light that affects the sensor and get a well-exposed photo. As I mentioned in the previous video, this is dependent somewhat on your intent for the photo. What parts of the image do you want well exposed? This is more critical when the light is very harsh, when there's a high contrast, or when you've got a high contrast subject and background. Most of the time you'll want your subject exposed well. Sometimes you'll want your subject to be silhouetted, in which case you'll have to choose to expose for the background. So all these options are available to you, but how do you know what is the right combination of settings to choose? Well, inside a camera there is another tool called an exposure meter, sometimes called a light meter, and this will give you the information that you need to be able to balance your exposures. It looks something like this in many cameras. Some cameras will give just a series of numbers with a plus and a minus display, but essentially you're wanting to choose your exposure settings so the meter will read at 0 when it's correct. This is the essential settings that you need to use your camera in manual mode. It may seem a little complicated at first, but believe me, it's worth learning, it's worth committing to and learning to do it well, because then you're in full creative control of how your photos look. Photography means painting with light or writing with light, so light has a huge amount to do with photography and the creativity in photography. After all, if there's no light, you can't take a photograph. So the more you can learn to expose your photos well and get the right amount of light to reach the sensor to create your pictures, the more creative you'll be able to be with your camera. Each of the three controls, the aperture, shutter speed and ISO, have numbered increments to help you to control and understand the balance between these settings. The aperture controls are measured in f-stops, the shutter speed is measured in fractions of seconds or seconds, and the ISO setting is in a series of straightforward numbers between 100, 200, 400 and upwards to 6400 and above. Each of these controls is measured by what we call stops in photography jargon. For example, if your camera is set to 1/125th of a second and you change it to 1/250th of a second, that's twice as fast. So you've effectively halved the amount of light coming into your camera. If your lens is set to f8 and you change that to f5.6, that's also one stop difference. opening the lens from f8 to f5.6 lets in twice as much light. And the same is with ISO setting. If you're at 100 ISO and you change to 200 ISO, you are doubling how responsive the sensor is to light. This might sound a little bit confusing, but once you practice it, once you've learned it, it becomes second nature. You'll do it without thinking about it. Your action and your response to the light will be as automatic as your camera's auto exposure settings. But you'll still be in creative control. You are not giving up the creative control to the camera's artificial intelligence. Your camera's AI is pretty incredible, but it is not creative. You are. And at photographycourse.net, we're all about encouraging you to control your camera manually so you can be as creative as possible with your photography.